Okay, I wonder if we are live for people at home. If anybody at home is watching, we're grateful for this hybrid experience of a couple people in the chapel here at First Presbyterian and for people at home watching on Facebook Live. And I wonder if this is working. Testing, and are we live?
Testing. Are you able to hear the audience mic okay from home? We want people at home to hear comments that people shared in the room.
So if anyone is at home and watching, you could send a little note on Facebook chat to say you can hear us okay, and we'll get started. Welcome to folks in the back. Love to see you here. Sorry we don't have a big crowd this particular Sunday. I guess it's a holiday weekend. KG, we good to go?
Just 1 second.
Oh, okay. We're always testing for the people that are watching at home on Facebook Live.
Testing. How is this microphone sounding at home? If you are watching at home, we invite you to join in the conversation. We will be monitoring the comments here on Facebook, and so you can share your comments and your questions in the Facebook chat, and we will bring those into our discussion.
Welcome to people at home. Welcome to anyone here in the John Calvin Chapel at First Presbyterian. We're glad you're watching, either live or maybe later in the week, whenever you're tuning in. Ever since COVID, we started this hybrid situation where we have some folks in the sanctuary, and we also have this ongoing Facebook Live experience where people can watch from home. So we're glad you're watching from home. Here at First Presbyterian, we've done a number of Christian ed options. We've studied some theology, we've done Bible studies, and the last series of events we've been doing were testimonies and profiles of people who have been peacemakers, agents of reconciliation in the world. God desires for his kingdom to bring reconciliation between people and people groups, between institutions, to work for justice and shalom throughout every square inch of God's good world. And so this storytelling season of folks testifying about organizations that they're involved in peacemaking has been really, really a fun thing to do over the last couple of weeks. Now we're going to have a new curriculum. The Hallelujah, our church newsletter, had something wrong in it from months ago. So I will tell you what we're going to do in case this is a surprise. Stephanie announced it last week. We are going to spend 5 weeks here in June with a video curriculum by a friend of ours named Bob Goff. The video curriculum is called Everybody Always. Bob Goff is a lawyer and an activist and a life coach who has done all sorts of remarkable things. He's been in central Pennsylvania more than once, and he's an old acquaintance of ours. We've met Bob a number of times, and he's one of the most amazing people I've met in my life, to be honest, as we'll see on the video. I'm going to just start off reading out loud the introduction from the little workbook here for the Everybody Always video curriculum. And it'll explain sort of what it's about. Here's what the introduction says. Forgive me while I read this out loud to you. It says, "Welcome to Everybody Always. It's good that you're here." Like, really good. Because the world we're living in right now is really good at something else. Division. It is great at teaching us to only trust people who talk like us, think like us, vote like us, live where we do, and see everything just like we do. And it also teaches us that anybody who talks, thinks, votes, worships, or sees the world differently than us can't really be trusted. They may even be our enemy. This way of seeing the world makes love pretty conditional, with the condition being we only have to love people that are just like us. Well, the good news is that God isn't like that. Not even close. God's love is unconditional, and it's for everybody. God's love turns enemies into friends, and it is bigger than all the things we cook up to divide ourselves. But God doesn't want to be the only one around here who loves that way. He wants us to love that way too. You see, God doesn't want us to love some people sometimes he wants us to love everybody, always. Everybody? Bob Goff says. Yes, everybody. The people we like and the people we don't. Yes. The people we respect and the people that creep us out. Exactly. The people we admire and the people we don't. Them too. Actually, everybody means everybody. Well, what about always? Does that mean literally always? Yes, it does. As in when we feel like it and when we don't. When it's easy and when it's hard. Bingo. When it gives us energy and when it wears us out. Precisely. For God always really means always. Now, if this sounds like a tall order, you're right. But you're also in luck. God does not leave us to love this way by trusting in our own willpower. The Holy Spirit is around to actually help us love this way. But there's another part too. This is something we can actually train to get better in. Like running a marathon or practicing an instrument, love is something we learn and grow in as we practice it. And that's where a study like this comes in handy. Well, he says it's a 5-week experiment in learning how to love everybody always like God does. Each session will explore a different aspect of this love through the teachings and stories of Bob Goff. There will be an opening question, a little Bible reading, and then we'll watch Bob on the video. Well, that's the introduction to this video curriculum about loving everybody always the way God does, through the power of the Spirit. Goff mostly tells stories, but we like to start each week with a Bible text. And so the text we're going to read together to start our curriculum here this week, for the next couple of weeks, is one that many of us know. And I would invite somebody to read it out loud for us. It's a famous story from the Gospel of Luke. That's one of the 4 biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. From Luke, the 10th chapter, Luke 10, starting at verse 25 and going to verse 37. Luke 10, 25 to 37. And as you may recognize, so if you are Bible people, you may know that's something famous called the story of the Good Samaritan. So who could read real loud so people at home can pick it up on the mic here? People at home, get your Bibles if you want to follow along. Who could read that for us? Please. Great. Real loud.
The parable of the Good Samaritan. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this, and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was the neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise.
Thank you. Well, it's a famous story. There's almost 2 parts to it. The first part is the story before the parable, before the story of the Good Samaritan that Jesus taught. What's the setting of the story? What's the first couple lines about? And anybody at home, if you want to chime in, just type into the chat in Facebook. Stephanie can read what you have to say. We're in a little bit of a time delay, but if you want to contribute, please do. I know there's some people watching at home, so type into the chat what you would say. What's going on? Just remind us, what's going on in the first couple sentences of this story, of this Bible reading? There's some traveling in the parable, but even before the parable, what's the first couple of verses?
How do we inherit eternal life? We're testing Jesus.
Who's asking that?
A lawyer.
A lawyer. Yeah, isn't that interesting? Bob Goff happens to be a lawyer, by the way. It's always a lawyer, Bob Goff says. It's trying to do what? He's sort of trying to, is he sincerely wanting to know about eternal life? Or maybe what? You're shaking your head no. Maybe what?
I think he's testing Jesus.
He's testing Jesus, she said. Maybe he's sort of trying to wiggle out of things. What do you really have to do to be saved? He's a rich young ruler. He's a rich guy. He's a lawyer. He's trying to trick Jesus or trap him. And so Jesus does what he often does. He cites another Bible passage, right? He's citing the Old Testament law. So what does Jesus say to him? What's the answer to this guy's question at first? In the little give and take between Jesus and the lawyer.
What do you think? How did you interpret it?
Interesting. Well, yeah. First he cites a law. He says, you know what you have to do. Love God with all your mind, your heart, your soul, your strength, right? This all-in commitment to love God with all you've got. And then the lawyer says, well, says what? Does he do that stuff? Does he say, yeah, I know that? Yeah.
Who's my neighbor?
Okay, then he says, yeah, all right. Love your neighbor as yourself, then is the next part. And then he says, okay, well, who is my neighbor? Like, really? Who do I really have to love then? So it gets interesting because the guy at first seems to be interested in eternal life. Maybe he's sincere, maybe not. Maybe he's trying to trick Jesus. Jesus cites the Old Testament law, love God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And then the guy wants to get picky. Oh, well, okay. Who really is my neighbor? Where does this love really mean? Who do I have to love? And so then Jesus now says, okay, instead of answering, well, it's your next door neighbor 2 doors down and anybody you happen, Jesus said, let me tell you a story. Who are the main characters in the story? What jumps out at you in the story? There's a bunch of different people. Anybody know who they are? The Samaritan, obviously. Who are the other main characters?
Levite.
A Levite
Priest.
and a priest. So you got these religious leaders, and as we all probably know, Samaritans in that culture were sort of the people on the wrong side of the track. Some of us on our Wednesday night Bible study are studying Isaiah together. And Isaiah, 1,000 years earlier, was the divided kingdom, you know, the civil war had happened between Israel, and there were the tribes and the different kingdoms. And Samaria was the enemy up here of the north, and nobody liked them. And so you end up with this Samaritans being almost sort of like in American culture, the African American or the immigrant, the people that mainstream culture despises and enslaves and hates. So Jesus has these wonderful people, a Levite and a priest, and then this kind of guy from the wrong side of the track. And who's the hero of the story? The Samaritan. It's a good Samaritan. We might say like a good, I don't know, Palestinian terrorist or Muslim terrorist, you know, somebody in our culture that everybody hates and fears. And Jesus picks that kind of a person as the hero of the story. And what does the guy do? He helps the guy. He's the one that stops and provides for the needs. So then what's the big upshot? Jesus said, who was the real neighbor? And his answer was what? The one that actually helped him. So what's the answer then to the guy's picky question, who is my neighbor?
It's the one who acts.
The one who acts is the one who responds to the neighbor. Who's the neighbor?
Everyone around us, I would think.
Could be almost anybody. And what particularly is unique about this guy on the side of the road?
He was despised by most.
He was probably despised.
He's a victim.
He's a victim. He was hurting, right? He's somebody that's really hurting, that has needs. Doesn't matter who he is, if he's really technically your neighbor. The person who is in need is a person that could be called your neighbor. And the person that is the good person that helps them may not be the person you think, the most religiously refined and theologically correct, but it's a person that acts. So it seems to me this story is going to sort of frame some of our conversation around the question of the law, of what it means to love God, what it means to love neighbor, and who is the neighbor. The expert in the law answers, who is my neighbor? And Jesus says it's anybody, particularly anybody who has need. Well, let me ask you this. The Samaritan showed what we might want to call extravagant love to the guy in need along the side of the road. He not only helped him out a little bit, who he didn't even know, but he gave him some extra money, right? And said, if you need anything, I'll put you up at the hotel. You need anything, put it on my tab. It was an extraordinary act of refugee resettlement, of care, of what we now call Good Samaritan behavior. It was extravagant. Let me ask this. Have you ever seen anybody offer extravagant love for no particular reason, but just because they wanted to be gracious to somebody? We might have all seen little glimpses of that. Anybody have stories of somebody you've seen that has shown extravagant love?
I have an example. It goes way back. My father-in-law was a pharmacist, and he had a pharmacy on Queen Street. He had a man who came into the pharmacy who had just moved to York, and he needed to get a job. And he was kind of down on his luck. So he didn't know this man, but he bought him a suit. And when my father-in-law passed away at the funeral, this man had read about his service, and he came in. He gave testimony that it was that act of love that he gave him when he didn't even know him, that
Wow.
allowed him to get a job.
He gave him this suit.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say, and he wore it to the funeral. What a beautiful story.
He gave a testimony
Yeah.
at the funeral that people never knew this
Huh.
happened.
I've heard at funeral stories like that too, where somebody stands up and shares something and nobody knew that the person was this extravagant in their sharing and their love for their neighbor. Anybody at home, Steph? Did anybody chime in there in Facebook Live?
Not yet, but we're watching. Folks
Okay.
at home, we'd love to hear your stories.
We were friends with an extraordinary woman who would befriend women in prison and be a pen pal to them, but also go visit them once a month. And in a lot of cases, women that were maybe a victim and responded and ended up incarcerated themselves that should never have been in prison. And then, but she would just walk with them through that
Yeah.
difficult time.
Wow, great. You know, last week when we were doing the profiles of peacemakers and agents of reconciliation in Sunday school here, I remember last week we heard the story of Delmo Rivera's father, who was a part of Calvary Presbyterian and eventually First Pres. And one of the things she said is the first Latino, first Hispanic doctor in York, and eventually started the Spanish American Center. One of the things he did, because he spoke Spanish, is he helped people read their mail. She said, who brings their mail to their doctor? But even though he had a busy medical practice, he would just help people whose English was struggling and would help translate their mail, even like government forms and stuff. Isn't that was just, I thought that was extravagant love right there from somebody in our church last week. Well, Bob is going to guide us through some stories of love. Let me just tell you this about Bob Goff before we turn on the video, because you need to know this. He makes a reference in passing one time, kind of a joke. He says it fast. He speaks faster than I do. And you just have to know this. One of the things Bob used to do, and I don't know if he still does now, I think he does, is he worked as an advocate against child soldiers and against sexual trafficking and slavery in African countries, also in India. He eventually started to defend some kids that were illegally arrested, packed into a building half the size of this, 40 kids. For years they lived in this prison. And he got him out because he's a lawyer. So he started to train other judges on how to adjudicate trials in Uganda, I think it was Uganda, about trafficking and slavery and fair trials and those kind of things. And he realized they didn't have a law school, so he couldn't train lawyers very well. So he bought a couple of books. He said, I went to their law library and I read their entire law library, which was like 2 books. He went to a party with the embassy. He bought him some drinks. It's kind of a funny long story. But he ends up becoming an ambassador authorized by the state of Uganda to be the head of their like Justice Department or something. He's not quite a cabinet member, but he has now immunity because he's a diplomat. So he flies the Ugandan flag in his home in San Diego. It's kind of funny because sometimes he'll say, he's speeding, yeah, arrest me. You can't, I have immunity. He makes jokes about how he has immunity. And at one point in the video, you'll say, he's talking about an episode with police. It's kind of funny. But he says, go ahead and arrest me. I've got immunity. Well, he really does because he kind of flies. His house is sort of like part of Uganda. There in San Diego. So Bob is a character. He does these kind of things. His first book was called Love Does, and he has a video curriculum about loving in action. He tells a story in there, you'll see some of it here, where one time to get people to love, he decided that they should have a parade in their neighborhood. But the thing is, you couldn't watch the parade, you had to be in it, because he wanted to get everybody involved. And they started on New Year's Day, a parade that every year gets bigger and bigger and bigger. They've done it for 20-some years now, and it's a huge, huge deal. And again, that was just an example of a parade that he himself started as an act of love so people could get to know their neighbors in their community. So that's a little bit about Bob Goff. You'll notice that this week he's going to talk about neighbors, but he's going to talk about next-door neighbors. So let's think about that together. Let's see if we can turn this on. If KG is not around, there he is. How do we get this on? Ooh, down here. This is the trailer. Okay, and this is loud enough. We're going to watch just the 1-minute trailer to set the stage for this.
Hey everybody, it's Bob Goff here, and I'm in the auditorium where I teach a class at a university. This class is on failure, and what we do is we just get a ton of students in here and get real about life. And it isn't always just this beautiful, like, awesome thing that happened. And my life, and perhaps yours as well, have been marked by a bunch of setbacks. I wrote a book called Everybody Always, and in this book I talk about how to love difficult people, how to love people when they failed and when we failed, but how to do it together and pointing fingers at each other, that we would engage one another and say, what do we do with that? And so my hope is that you'll take some of the study materials that we made in this little video course, and it's a kind of an adjunct to the book, and I hope that it'll prompt you to have some great conversations about when things were right, when things went wrong, and what you did about it, what you learned about your own faith. All right, you guys, thanks a million. I'll see you later.
Everybody got a pen? If anybody comes up any closer to see it or hear it better, and this is going to be
Hi, everybody. It's Bob Goff here. I'm sitting on my back porch, and I'm just so glad that we're going to get some time over the coming weeks to just talk about some stories, to talk about how we love one another. And we start with the people that are nearby, that are people that are in the blast radius of your love already. This series is called Everybody Always, and there's a book that goes along with it. But the most important thing I want you to know is that you're welcome here. There's something beautiful about just being welcomed. Plenty of us have been invited to things, right? Have you ever been invited somewhere you weren't welcome? There's a big difference. And so one of the things that I think that we can do in our lives is to let people know they're not just invited, they're actually welcome. And once people are welcome, they start sharing stories. And my hope is that we can just spend this next time together sharing a couple stories. And a win would be this, that after you're done watching this, you're sharing stories. Say, how has that happened to you? Where was a time that you saw somebody give away extravagant love? Who was your neighbor? We're going to talk first about a neighbor of mine. She's somebody that's taught me a tremendous amount about loving people. It was always a lawyer like me that tried to set up Jesus. Remember, he came up and said, tell me the big commandment. And Jesus said to love God with your heart and your soul and your mind. And he said, let me tell you another one, to love your neighbor like yourself. I learned a lot about loving your neighbor from a neighbor of mine who lived across the street. Sweet Marie and I had been married for a couple years, and we bought our first house. And I was so excited about this house of ours. We did everything. It was actually pretty nasty. We lived in the driveway in a motorhome for almost a year because there was a bunch of feral cats running around. It was just nasty. They were everywhere, and they were evidently afraid of mice because there was mice everywhere too. So we finally decided to take a step down in our lifestyle and move into the home we own. And we tried to make this home ours. And over the course of a year or two, we just nailed it. It was beautiful. It was the house of Maria's dreams. Well, I was having breakfast with a friend, and I overheard the guy in the booth next to me talking to the person he was with about how he's going to sell his house. And it was right by my favorite surfing spot. The name of the surfing spot was Garbage. And so I slid into the booth next to him and said, man, I'm so sorry for eavesdropping, but it sounds like you're going to sell your house. I know your house. Is there any way you want to swap for mine? And I did one of those George Banks things. I threw in the china. We literally traded houses over waffles. Well, I got home, I told Sweet Maria what a terrific deal I'd done. I blindfolded her, I drove her over to our house, and I took the blindfold off, and I was pointing at the house and back to my surf spot in the house, and she started crying. And she told me every marriage gets one of those. And I just used up 2 of those. Well, we stayed in that house for a couple years, and she fixed it up, and she did what she does to everything else in my life. She takes my garbage and makes it beautiful. But then when it's time to sell the house we had before, so we put a for sale sign in the lawn, and 5 people wanted to buy this thing. But we weren't looking for a buyer, we were looking for a neighbor. There's a big difference. You do business with buyers, you do life with your neighbors. And Carol came along. And Carol was a widow, and James in the book talks about widows and orphans and how we're supposed to treat them. So we gave her a big group hug, and we said, Carol, you're our neighbor. And Carol moved in and lived there for the next 22 years. Carol became a famous family member, not just a family friend. As a matter of fact, our son and daughter-in-law got married in our backyard. And in the front row, there was a couple seats, and one was for Carol. when the kids were growing up, they used to run across the street to Carol's house. They'd tell her stories about how they would throw balls in the hall at each other, and they coined the phrase hall ball for this game they would play. They told her about how my other son got married to a life-size Barbie with my daughter officiating. They even told her about how my other son lost a frog in the living room. And every time when they tell Carol these stories, she'd put her hands over her mouth and act like it was the first time they told her, even though it was the 20th time. She'd ask him again, tell me about the frog that got away. And the whole time she would fill them with mountains of cookies. And we have a parade. We have this beautiful tradition on our block because we think this idea of loving your neighbors means you need to know them so that you can love them. So we started throwing a parade. We've had this parade for 22 years. It's been terrific. And Carol was the queen one year. You guys, it's great. When she goes to the grocery store, people bow to her and call her Your Majesty. It'll take her 45 minutes just to fill her tank up with gas. Everybody's interrupting her, saying, let me do that for you. It's really just beautiful. And I think there's something about loving our neighbors that was woven into the DNA. I know it's woven into our faith. It was so important that Jesus said, that's where we'd start, not where we'd end. Carol and I talk to each other. We've been talking to each other on the cell phones for 20 years. And I just don't want her to be alone. And I think that's probably why God made so many people on earth, so nobody would have to be lonely for very long. And one day I called Carol, and she said she just got back from the doctor and she'd gotten some bad news. The doctor said, Carol, you have cancer. And so I rushed over to her house, but I stopped at Radio Shack and I got us 2 walkie-talkies. And I put the walkie-talkie in her bedroom. I put the other walkie-talkie in ours. And for the next couple of years, Carol and I started talking to each other on the walkie-talkie. There's something beautiful. It's kind of like stringing 2 peach cans together. Because when you're on the walkie-talkies, you're like 9 years old. You're up in tree forts. Nobody's got cancer. The first time I called her up, I said, hello, Carol? You got to make the sound. She said, Bob, is that you? I'm like, who else would it be? And for the next couple of years, Carol and I only talked on the walkie-talkies. And you know what? These walkie-talkies didn't fix her cancer, but she wasn't afraid anymore. I think that's God's message to us. It's always been his message to us. He said it to Joshua. He said, you're taking over for Moses. And Joshua said, I can't do that. He said, Joshua, be not afraid. God said it to Abram before this big battle. He said, in your great reward, be not afraid. Jesus said it to 4 dudes in a rowboat, and he came walking out on the water, and he said, it is I, be not afraid. I think he knew that if we weren't afraid, then nobody would be afraid. It would spread like a cold, just the best kind of cold in the world. That we would see what he's doing in our lives, in the lives of the people he surrounded us, and we'd get another peek at what he might be doing in the world. And we start with our neighbors. Well, Carol took a turn, and we ended up visiting her in the hospital after this operation, and I brought the walkie-talkie with me. And I gave it to the nurse and had her bring it to Carol. And I slipped into the bed in the other side of the room. And I had a walkie-talkie. And I turned it on after saying a prayer that God would allow Carol to just stay with us for a little bit longer. And when I turned it on, I said, hello, Carol? And you could hear a little fumbling around in the bed next door. And Carol said in a really weak voice, Bob, is that you? And I said, oh, Carol, it is. And we just cried and cried together. When my kids were really young, when they had trouble sleeping, what I'd do is I'd rub their nose, like right here. And Carol and I talked about her life, and we talked about Jesus and a life together, and I'd rub her nose until she would fall asleep. Carol had these really unique appetite, like things that would sweep over her. And she decided she wanted this particular kind of hot dog. And I think they must only make 4 or 5 a year, because I drove around to every single deli in San Diego trying to find one. I finally found the hot dogs. I wanted to spike it in the aisle. It's like, yes, it was like finding Jimmy Hoffa. And I rushed home. I showed her the hot dog, and she said, I want to see the package. She knows I'm a lawyer and I might go Oscar Mayer on her. That's what neighbors do. That's what we were meant to do. We were meant to find our joy, and part of our joy is helping other people find theirs. We brought Carol home to be among her friends and family for the last days that she'd spend with us here on Earth. And I asked Carol, do you have kind of a bucket list thing? Something you always wanted to do that you've just never gotten around to doing before? And she said, you know what? I've always wanted to toilet paper someone's house. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Well, the next day she called me at 4 p.m. and she's like, let's go. I'm like, girl, you usually go at midnight, but whatever. So we went across the street and we started throwing toilet paper over the neighbor's tree. And she had this thing. She's got quite an arm, too. And just as we were getting the last roll over the top, the cops showed up. They turned on their lights. They said, this is a misdemeanor. I'm like, buddy, I have diplomatic immunity. She's dead in a week. Sue me. Well, that's what happens. You guys, you just want to find that childlike faith. Jesus spent a ton of time with his friends talking about that. 2 of his friends actually were arguing about who'd get the big chair next to him in heaven. And he said, I'll tell you the truth, unless you change and become like a child, you'll never enter the kingdom of God. I was raised, you just say a prayer. Evidently, there's more. It's a childlike faith. Not childish, guys. We've got that nailed. But a childlike faith. Think of that playfulness. Think of the younger version of you. What do you do when you lose the keys to your car? You go back and you say, where was the last place I saw them? Think to yourself, where was the last place I saw my joy? Where was the last place that I felt like this idea of curiosity? What was happening around me? Who lived around me? Who were my neighbors? We had one last New Year's Day parade. And my prayer was that Carol would make it long enough to see one last parade. And she was too weak to make it outside that day. And so we picked her up and we put her in the front window of her home. What Carol didn't know is we changed the parade route. And all 700 of us walked right through her front yard. And Carol sat in her chair, blowing kisses goodbye to her friends. And kids put their noses up against the windows and bounced balloons. And that next week, Carol went home to heaven. It would have been her second parade of the week. And you know what Carol taught me? She taught me the value of knowing your neighbors, and not just knowing about them or just waving to them, but diving into their lives. And because we did a cannonball into Carol's life, she did a cannonball into ours. And she taught us more about our faith. She taught us more about these beautiful ideas that Jesus shared with a lawyer: to love God with your heart, your soul, your mind, and love your neighbor like yourself. Here's the deal, you guys. Like, we want to love everybody on earth. Like this idea that God so loved the whole world. But what we need to do is start across the street. Find these people that God's already put in proximity to you, and then you be present with them. And I know God makes us in every different flavor, but what he made for us is to understand more about him by understanding more about the neighbors that he put around us. And if we keep avoiding people, we'll never meet our neighbors, and we'll miss out on some of what God has. I meet people that don't want to be people, and I'm like, oh, you're gonna hate heaven. Everybody, always, right? So start with your neighbors. Here's just a practical thing. You've got a neighborhood full of people. Go and meet people. I literally bring them a candy cane. Don't wait for Christmas. Like, drop them a note and say, I'm just grateful to be your neighbor. Find some way to connect. I've got a neighbor that for a dozen years took my garbage out every single Monday morning. And he put it back. He's running this huge corporation, but he spent every single week taking my garbage out and putting it away. You know why? He knew what it meant to love your neighbor, and I think you do too. You're probably amongst a group of them now. You might be in different neighborhoods, but God sees this earth as one big neighborhood. So you don't have to, again, go across an ocean. My hope is that what you'll do is you'll listen to these things and then tell stories amongst yourselves about your neighbors and how you've engaged them. And you can't love them if you don't know them. So what's a big step for you? Who are you going to get to know? What's your next courageous move? And I'll tell you, it might be just next door to that side or across the street. Find them, and I tell you what, you'll find a little bit more about your faith. You'll find out more about who God is. You'll know more about who you are. And you know what else you'll know? You'll know who your neighbors are. Go across the street, find somebody, and take the next courageous step for you. And we aren't going to compare leaps because God doesn't do that. He isn't interested in what you do compared to what I do and the next person. But what he did is he planted these beautiful people around you. I hope you'll go and meet them because you'll find out more about who he is. You'll find out more about who you are when you find out more about who your neighbors are. All right, you guys, so long.
Character, isn't he? Bob Goff. In the back of his books, he puts his phone number in case you want to call him. And he really answers. I've done it already. So maybe at the end we can call him and tell him we're watching his video, see what he said. What struck you? Did you take any little notes? Did you write anything down to remember that just struck you or that you wanted to talk about? What leapt out at you? A line that Bob said or an idea that he offered? Anybody want to share anything? Anybody at home? Feel free to write anything down if you liked any of this or anything struck you.
I was really struck at the very, very beginning when he introduced this week and said we're starting off by talking about loving people close to us. And he used the phrase, the people within the blast radius of your love. And that phrase really caught my attention, blast radius of your love.
You usually think of a blast radius as a bad thing, like where a bomb goes in, it's a certain radius, but he called it the blast radius of your love. So where is the circle? How far does your love reach? Later at the end, he said proximity, that God has put you in proximity with certain people. Maybe your next door neighbor or somebody at work, but there's certain proximity we all have to a certain number of people. So who those people are might be a good step. In fact, in the workbook, if we were a small group at home and had an hour and a half, he has a little chart where he asks you to list people to your right, to your left, behind you, across the street where you live, to name them if you can, and to fill out this little chart of how many people you know in your own neighborhood. That's a good exercise itself. Who is in the blast radius, and do you know them? Not a bad question. Thank you, Steph.
And I think part of what made that phrase powerful for me was the idea that love itself is impactful, is powerful. It makes an impression.
Huh. Love is like that force. Yeah, good, thanks.
I like that, unless you have faith like a child, and he clarified childish,
Yeah,
different from childlike. I
Yeah.
had never heard that before. I really like that.
Yeah. And he linked that to finding your joy and your enthusiasm and your curiosity, that there's something playful about wonder and awe and beauty and playfulness in a child. And so they don't worry about stuff. And so he said, our joy, go back like when you lost your car keys. Go back to the last place where you can remember your joy, when you had a childlike faith that brought joy. Go back and figure that out. But he said you can find your joy when you help others find theirs. Wasn't that an interesting idea? That part of loving your neighbor isn't just like helping the needy, but it's helping people discover who God wants them to be and what brings them joy. So how do we find joy? By finding others, helping them find their joy. That was interesting, wasn't it? Have you ever thought of that? Anybody ever story about that in your own life?
You know, you often hear people say get in touch with your inner child.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I've heard that a lot, but I also wrote down that sentence about where was the last place I saw my joy, because like I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. I might have to go way back.
We're going through some stuff at work, and we literally had people in the lab crying because it's so bad. And so I said, okay, it's time for bad jokes. Let's just start telling bad jokes. And people started laughing so hard it hurt. And I was like, okay.
Oh, that's a great
what do
story.
we need that I don't mean inappropriate jokes.
Yeah.
Just stupid
Dumb jokes.
Fun, yeah.
As a way to break some of the sadness at the workplace. Not to sweep it under the rug, but to change the mood a little bit. Let's tell the bad jokes. That's hilarious. That's a great idea. Who would have thought that as a Christian ministry? But that's the kind of stuff Bob does.
Need to bump out of this place where we are into another place so we can be more practical in handling what's hard.
Great. Oh, that's good.
We've got a friend chiming in online here. Michelle says, I just love that he truly went out of his way to show love. Search every grocery store and go to Radio Shack.
Yeah. Yeah, he had to find that special hot dog for somebody, and he said, I went to every deli in San Diego. And the Radio Shack thing, that's pretty cool. Like, he went out of his way, bought something. Of course, he has the means to do that, but to go out and buy a walkie-talkie for a lady, to have some fun with her, and to help her cope with her cancer in that way. Yeah, he went out of his way to do stuff.
And then she goes on to say, I think sometimes that I don't have the bandwidth to include more folks in my life. But I'm so encouraged to reach out for that is what we are made for.
Wow. Thank you, Michelle. That's exactly how I feel often, that I don't have the bandwidth to do this stuff. I don't know where he gets his energy and his time and his money to do all these things. Start a parade, TP somebody's house in the middle of the afternoon. I'm at work. So I've often asked Bob, like, how do you do this stuff? But you find time to do the things that you really believe in doing. And so I'm with Michelle. I sometimes don't think I have the bandwidth to do all this. But he says it's in our DNA. We're wired that way as people made in God's image to show love to others. And it's certainly wired in our story as Christians that loving our neighbor as ourselves is part of what we're wired to do. It's in our DNA, he said. What do you think of that? Are we wired for this stuff? Is this the heart of being a human? Is learning to connect with others? Yeah.
I found a connection between what he first said about being welcome, the hospitality, and then later on talking about becoming like a child. I just feel like there's a connection with that, and that's why I love to be around children, I think, because there's an immediate openness and hospitality.
Isn't that interesting?
Act to just, because I, through a lot of filters, maybe in baggage, will limit. But I think for the most part, children are, well, let's just go. But, you know.
I hope everybody heard that at home, and that's Mike picked it up. That was so good, Wendy. Yeah. Children don't have that baggage and filter, so they can be more hospitable. And so a childlike faith that he said near the end of the video, she linked it to the very beginning. Do you remember that very thing he said in the intro? He said, I want to welcome you here. Have you ever been invited to some place where you didn't feel welcome? That's an interesting question, isn't it? People invite people to stuff. We all get invited. They say, you should come to this, come to that. And then you show up, but are you welcome? So that hospitality of being welcoming, that's a good sign, a practice of loving others right there. Learning to be more hospitable and more welcoming. Thank you, Wendy. And maybe we can learn it from children. Any other comments? We have time for just one or two more. Steph.
I'm thinking, especially about Michelle's comment about bandwidth, I'm thinking about how important it is to recognize that we all are wired differently and express love in different ways and have different gifts to offer. And that not all of us have thrown a parade for the whole town in our DNA.
Yeah.
That's not going to be an authentic expression of love for maybe many of us.
Okay.
Some people have that sort of gift. Others of us have very different gifts that might be inclined to connect and show care in subtler ways or in quieter ways. And those are valid too. So sometimes figuring out what does it actually look like for me in my unique personality and life and context to love
thank you for saying that. I couldn't have said it better. Yeah. Not everybody is wired in that particular way to show that extravagant extroverts sort of love. He almost dismissed that a little in the video. And so you're right. There's different ways we're all wired. We have different capacities, different skills, different neighborhoods, different abilities. And so to discern how we find our own unique joy by loving in the particular way that we're wired to, given our personality type or our Myers-Briggs or whatever. We all have different ways to do that. But the principle's the same though, right? That's no excuse to say, well, I'm wired to be selfish, so I don't have to go do this. We still do have to learn to love our neighbors. And the question, who is our neighbor, is still a pressing one. Bob didn't necessarily link it to the needy. For him, it was just, let's start with our neighbors. Let's learn to practice this stuff. We'll get to the really poor and oppressed later, perhaps. But let's at least start loving our cotton-picking neighbors, learning their names at least. Bring them a candy cane, he said, even if it's not Christmas. That's kind of funny. Now, maybe that's not your style, but learning your neighbors isn't a bad step, right? Maybe we could jot down some thoughts about that ourselves. He says here in a little discussion booklet, people don't grow when they're informed. They grow when they're accepted. Do we do that very well? It comes back to sort of this hospitality question. That to move into this, to lean into this question of practicing love, we have to at least, what's the text say? Love your neighbor as yourself. So maybe